Nick, I've got your book in my hand, your latest book, The Monster Files. Or Monster Files. There is no article in front of Monster. Monster Files. A look inside government secrets and classified documents on bizarre creatures and extraordinary animals. Tell me, with this book, I'm assuming this is going to be an awful lot like some of the other books you've written, Pyramids of the Pentagon, UFOs, the Collins Elite, all of these things where there's governmental connections. Tell me what people can expect in this book. What do you find is the most intriguing monster cryptid that you had to deal with, and what is it that ties it to the government?
Sure. Well, for me, I think the most fascinating aspect, the entire book, for the most part, is based, again, like the Pyramids of the Pentagon, which deals with government files on ancient mysteries. This one deals with government files on weird, allegedly real creatures like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and so on. But for me, the most fascinating file was one that I found at the British National Archives at a place called Kew in the county of Surrey, which is where the government keeps all its declassified files. You know, we're talking millions and millions of pages. You know, it's kind of like the equivalent of the US National Archives. And there's actually a file there titled Sea Serpents, which was put together by the old Admiralty, the Royal Navy, which is the equivalent of the US Navy. And the file runs from roughly 1830 to about 1880, and it's packed with reports from the crews, the captains of military Admiralty ships in that period who'd seen gigantic sea serpents predominantly out in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the files, when you read the reports, I mean, it sounds like something straight out of sci-fi until you realize that the captain of the ship has written the report based upon the crew sightings and even, you know, the captain's sightings as well. And they talk about sightings of vast creatures. I mean, literally like 250 to 300 feet long serpentine animals sort of breaking the surface of the Atlantic. And
these are coming from these are official documents where these guys have recorded, these captain's logs.
Yes, these have all surfaced at the National Archives, and anyone can go down there and read them, and they're all official, what's called Admiralty files, and they span about 50 years. But what's interesting is that whoever put the file together, they weren't just collecting reports from the military. They're actually dozens of old newspaper clippings from the 1800s where, you know, there are titles like Sea Serpent Seen Again Off the Coast, that kind of thing. So for some reason, somebody within the Admiralty was actively and interestingly enough collecting and collating reports on gigantic sea monsters, if you like, with things that most people relegate to sort of fantasy and folk tales, you know, but to find the military had opened a file was, for me, that's probably my favourite one because it was so bizarre. You know?
In Chapter 6... Oh, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, do you know what, listening to what Nick's going on and listening to what you're saying, I kind of find a reassurance. And I'm not going to take any stance here. I'm not going to take an academic stance or any other stance. And this is just purely me on a personal level. I kind of find it reassuring that our mutual governments throughout the whole world do take an interest in these particular subjects. Because at the end of the day, you know, we kind of distance ourselves sometimes from our governments. We make them these separate institutions. You know, they're far above us. And if you want to go down the conspiratorial route, you know, the elite and the New World Order and all that stuff. And we always put the governments kind of in that hazy area because they are public servants and so forth. But I kind of find it reassuring that they're actually investigating these phenomena, because I mean it makes up part and parcel of our life as the general public, and we are entwined with superstition and mythology and so forth. And you know, ufology is a huge drawing, a huge gathering of different diverse people across the planet. And I think it is reassuring that our governments are taking an interest in and opening these files and investigating them. I think it's wonderful. From a personal point of view.
Well, that's good. I mean, for me, you know, I think the more I look into it, the more I find that there really isn't much that official agencies haven't looked at when, you know, things that fall under the spectrum of what you might call the paranormal. You know, everybody knows about the UFO angle and even things like remote viewing and the psychic spying experiments and tests that were done in the 70s and so on. But when you find, the ancient astronauts angle, they're looking into that, and ancient mysteries and the demonic angle for UFOs, and then they're looking into Bigfoot and all these cryptozoology type creatures, you begin to realize that, as I said, there really isn't much they haven't delved into,
What is your take on this whole notion of this whole conflict, these two concentric circles, science over here, or maybe three or four, faith over here, belief over here, and then the kinds of belief that have nothing to do with faith or religion or science, but are into totally different realms? How do you find that these things converge, or do they? Are they at complete loggerheads with each other? Because, like you mentioned, you write about things. You just go. You just take the topic and you go. You do your research. You write about it. You don't. It's almost like you don't care what people think about what your motivation is for writing. So, what do you think of these?
I wouldn't say I don't care about what people think. What I would say is that I don't feel the need to force feed one particular viewpoint. What I do is present the evidence and the data, and put the story out, and I point that out. I say this is the story as we've been able to find it. But when you talk about these sort of conflicts between belief and science and religion and all this type of stuff, I think a perfect example of how these things do become intertwined is with Ray Bochet's story, the Anglican priest, where he was talking about this particular group that came within officialdom that came to the conclusion that the demonic theory was the correct one for the UFO phenomenon. Their view was that, their way of working was to use science and to try and contact these entities via remote viewing. So in other words, they were using an applied form of science that, the CIA had been researching for years, but they believed that the entities that answered, the remote viewing sessions were demonic. So in other words, you've got physicists trying to use their mind to contact these things, but then coming to the conclusion that they were dealing with creatures that are a definitive part of religion, demons. So, but they were, as I said, they were physicists. So you've got a combined paranormal, science, and religion example, all in one particular category, so to speak.
Well, what do you think of this notion, this idea, then, that many of these things that we experience, we talk about how our ancient ancestors, that there was paleo contact, that they may have had visitations from extraterrestrials, people not of this world, that they may have had those encounters. But then we read all about them, Egypt in particular. You look at the inscriptions with all the gods. Are these, do you think, then, characters that they met, actual personages, or the cryptids, the ancient gods, all of these things, could they possibly just be what our ancestors experienced, except they labeled them as gods, they labeled them as things, but they're things that really exist?
Well, yeah, I think one important thing to remember is that we often apply belief systems, not necessarily deliberately, but belief systems are applied based around existing belief systems. That's to say, one person's demon 2,000 years ago is somebody's extraterrestrial grey, today. But who's to say it's not actually part and parcel of the same thing? I'll give you a classic example. If you talk about fairies, now, of course, everybody today has this image of fairies, of, little female character with wings that appears on Christmas cards. That's actually quite a relatively modern imagery. But if you go back sort of hundreds of years into sort of British folklore, and things like fairies and goblins, they're actually quite sinister, dwarfish entities that would sort of surface at night, and they would kidnap chilled babies and leave what were called changelings, and people who encountered the fairies would experience missing time and things like this. And actually parallel, a lot of the encounters with so-called fairies and magical, like the little people, so to speak, a lot of those stories parallel today's alien abduction stories. And, there are clear parallels, there's no doubt about that. But, one person's goblin 500 years ago is somebody else's extraterrestrial black-eyed alien today. And it's somebody's demon 2,000 years ago. So, in that respect, I think I think we are guilty, albeit subconsciously or unconsciously, of putting labels on things, but it could just be the interpretation of the people of that era. But I think the important thing is that in the same way that we see strange things in the sky today, the ancients did as well. And I think that's an important thing to point out, that something's been going on our skies for as long as we've been around, even if we put different themes and ideas and concepts on what it might be. And when you've got all around the world stories about the gods coming down and teaching people, and et cetera, and many of these nations, are totally unconnected back then because of the sheer distances involved, then I think you've got to look at it from the perspective of, in most folklores, there's some sort of truth, even if it's distorted. There's a true angle to it from somewhere, and I think the true angle is that we had interaction with something. The big question is, what was it? Right, and
that's the $1 million question right there. Is what exactly was it? Now, with I'm looking at just the back cover of Monster Files, and it's talking about how you've got here. What do the Russians know about animal ESP? You ask why is the British government file on sea serpents? And what's the link between the CIA and the abominable snowman? Is there a link between the CIA and the abominable snowman?
There actually is, and it's in a really weird way. I wish I could say that it's something like, the CIA have got a body of a Yeti on ice.
Right, that was another thing.
Yeah, it actually doesn't relate to that at all. But what happened was that in the 1950s, far more today than today, there was a great deal of interest in the story of the abominable snowman, and a lot of investigations and expeditions were launched from the early 50s onwards, with a lot of notable mountaineers involved. Now, this period of sort of mid to late 1950s was when Tibet was in a very fraught and dicey state, and eventually led the Dalai Lama to flee. Because there were a lot of rumors and stories that the Chinese were going to invade and just take over Tibet completely. Well, it so happens that one person who was out doing a lot of Yeti investigations in Tibet at this particular time, when this whole fraught situation going on with the Chinese, was a man named Tom Slick. And Tom Slick was a self-made millionaire from San Antonio, Texas, who had a deep passion for cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals. But he was also someone who was heavily plugged into the official world, and he was like a mover and shaker, and he knew the Bush family and Howard Hughes and all sorts of other people who had sort of quasi links with the intelligence world. And when Tom Slick was out in Tibet on one of his Yeti hunts, he was actually approached by the CIA, who said, hey, we know you're doing legitimate hunts for the Yeti, but because he was like a definitive player around town and knew everybody, they said, can you keep your eyes open and your ears open? If you hear any mutterings or rumors about sort of Chinese spies operated in the area, that kind of thing, can you let us know? And, of course, the ingenious thing was that if Tom Slick did a bit of localized spying for legitimate reason, to see what the Chinese were going to do, were they going to invade, he could legitimately say, well, I'm just here on a Yeti hunt. So, in other words, the CIA wasn't so much interested in determining on whether or not the Yeti existed, but it was how an investigation into the Yeti could be sort of manipulated as a cover story for doing some espionage research in the very same area.
Oh, sure, I get it. Well, hey, Nick, can you hold on over the break for us, and can you perhaps take a couple of questions after the bottom of the hour? Can we keep you a few more minutes?
Oh, yeah, keep going as long as you like. I don't mind.
All right, fantastic. Folks, Nick Redfern and Dr. John Ward and I will be back with you right after this break. Hang on.
It's a lot like riding a two-humped camel. Intrepid Radio with Scotty Roberts and Dr. John Ward. Intelligent talk.